Bienvenidos, welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us. I know this has been a very long semester, so we appreciate you making the time to come and join us in this conversation. On behalf of the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies of the CUNY Graduate Center, it is my pleasure to welcome you. We have with us tonight Dr. Gutierrez and Dr. Geraldo Cadava. I'm going to do an introduction to Dr. Gutierrez, and he will introduce Dr. Cadava. So if you give me 1 minute, let me pull here. Before I go into my brief introductions, I just want to note that we will be recording this event. So if you prefer not to have your name, you can change your name or you can close your window. We will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. So please post them in the chat as they occur to you, and we will collect them and then share them with John as he moderates the Q&A at the end. John Gutierrez is an assistant professor of the Department of Latin American and Latinx Studies at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. He is a specialist in the history of Spanish-speaking Caribbean and its diasporas in the United States. His current research focuses on the history of the anti-tuberculosis movement in late 19th and early 20th century Cuba. His work has appeared in journals including Cuban Studies and the Journal of Interdisciplinary History, and his opinion pieces have been published in El Diario La Prensa and Daily News in New York. Before joining the John Jay faculty, Gutierrez served as a vice president of the Miram Group, a lobbying, political consulting and research firm based in New York City. He was a founding editor-in-chief of the Manhattan Times, Manhattan's only bilingual community-based weekly newspaper. He currently serves as a vice chair of the Northern Manhattan-based Amber Charter Schools, New York State's first Latino-led charter school network. Welcome everyone, pardon for all the popping in the background. I'm handing it over to you, John. Thank you.
Thanks, Victoria. I appreciate it. Thanks for the introduction. It's nice to be here virtually. Especially in this event co-hosted by the CLACLS. Before we got on here, I had mentioned to Jerry that you know, the center is my home away from home at CUNY, and so it's lovely to be able to partner with you guys on this project. We're really excited for tonight's program because we get to welcome a guy who is a hot ticket in the U.S. Latino history world. And we don't often say that about historians, but he actually literally is a hot ticket. Gerry Cadava is an associate professor of history in the Department of History in Latina and Latino Studies at Northwestern University. He's the author of 2 books. The first is Standing on Common Ground, The Making of a Sunbelt Borderland, which was published by Harvard University Press in 2013. And the second, which is what brings him here this evening, is The Hispanic Republican, The Shaping of an American Political Identity from Nixon to Trump, which was published this past spring by Echo and imprint of HarperCollins. If you look in the chat, you'll see that we have a link to Jerry's book, which has been graciously discounted by the folks over at HarperCollins. This is a conversation about the book. It's not a book presentation per se. So I have a couple of questions based on my reading of the book. And then after we do that, we'll get to your questions as they appear in the chat. Let's get down to business. I want to start by telling you, Jerry, what sort of prompted me to reach out to you, and that is that before Election Day, my colleague at John Jay, Jose Luis Morin, who I think is on here, organized a panel discussion with students and faculty at John Jay to talk a little bit about their anxieties around Election Day. And it was a fascinating conversation, but one of the things that came up is that I guess probably a week to 10 days before we had this online session, there were reports in the press, and there had been some polling that showed that President Trump was doing better than expected among Latino voters. And my colleagues and I sat there, I think, in amazement that our students seemed to be shocked by this. You know, I read in the introduction to your book that you wanted the book in some ways to get away from these sort of stereotypical ideas that Hispanic Republicans were traitors to their own people, that they were Tío Toms, which is a phrase that I love. And here, you know, here we were with students who were expressing, in some ways, many of these same critiques. So part of the reason that we wanted to have you here is to help us provide some historical context for how it is that the Latino community and the GOP developed a relationship over time. And so I guess the first thing that I wanted to ask you was what piqued your interest here? What was the reason? I mean, you wrote about the Sun Belt, right, which is a unique sort of political environment in U.S. political history. But what was it about the relationship between Latinos and the GOP that attracted your attention in the first place?
Yeah, I think I, you know, kind of joked somewhere in the acknowledgements to this book that this was the second book that I've written about my grandfather, or at least inspired by my grandfather. And excuse me, the book about the Sun Belt, you know, well, I guess I should first tell you a little bit about my grandfather to provide a little context for that. But he retired from Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, Arizona. And that's where he worked for a lot of his years in the Air Force, and then went on to wash dishes at a country club and work in copper mines around Arizona. And he moved to Tucson, and my family settled in Tucson in the 60s when they moved there to work, when my grandparents moved there to work in the military. And my mom's dad was also in the Air Force, and they lived right across the street from each other. So my family's history in Tucson is really a story of you know, moving to Tucson during its moment of Sunbelt growth. And I just had a lot of memories as a kid of going to the border in Nogales and, you know, as tourists really, and wanting to write about the place that I was from. And so that book was inspired by my grandfather's life in a lot of ways, my family's settlement in Tucson. This one was inspired by him in a different way. He is a Hispanic Republican. He's Colombian and Panameño and Filipino. He was born in Panama in the Canal Zone, and then became a citizen by joining the US military at the tail end of World War II. He voted for a Republican for the first time in 1980 when he voted for Ronald Reagan. And this is when he was working at a copper mine near Tucson. And his idea was that Reagan was promising to put more money back into his biweekly paycheck. So he voted for Reagan. He was one of thousands of Reagan Democrats, or Democrats for Reagan. And but then over the last 4 decades, he has kind of embraced whole cloth every position of the Republican Party. And so I'd say beginning in the 1990s, when I was a teenager, that's when we started to argue about politics and about immigration and the border and welfare policy and all kinds of things. And I think in a lot of ways, this book is part of my ongoing conversation with him. And I think that having those arguments with my grandpa also helped me approach the topic of Latino conservatives with a degree of empathy, because I do, you know, believe my grandfather to be a good man. I mean, he's my grandpa. We might have argued about politics, but I never saw him as a race traitor or a sellout or a Tío Tomás or Tío Taco or a Pocho or any of these other words. He was someone I disagreed with, but you know, I thought that Latino Republicans should be seen as serious political actors, even if we disagree with them. So I think that just helped me kind of have interviews with dozens of people who I don't necessarily agree with politically, but I can see them as serious political actors with political ideas. So that's why I got interested in it. I mean, there's all kinds of things about the thinking like a nerdy academic or something, all of the ways in which writing about Latino Republicans fills gaps in historiography, like all that. But it was more of like a,
which is not a small thing. I mean,
yeah.
I'm gonna pay you a compliment here, which is I think that the book does not only a great job of filling in a number of important historiographical holes, but you raise some questions that researchers in the future should dig into very, very carefully, because I think and I think that's the mark of good historical scholarship. Let me because your grandfather's a former Democrat, and early on in the book you discuss the way in which even in the Eisenhower years, one of the key arguments, and it seems to be like a recurring argument that Republicans make to Latino Democrats, one of the arguments was that Democrats seem to take Latino voters for granted, right? That they had been beneficiaries of New Deal politics or New Deal programs under President Roosevelt and then later Truman. But ultimately, there was this sense that they showed up during campaign season and then forgot about them otherwise. And I'm wondering, if you could explain a little bit, and I know this is asking you to think about the Democrats rather than the Republicans, but what was it exactly that the Democrats weren't doing that made them sort of suspect in the eyes of Latino voters?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because that idea that Democrats come around looking for votes during election year, but then ignore us. I mean, I feel like you could hear Chuck Rocha from formerly of the Sanders campaign saying the exact same thing about Democrats and Joe Biden this year. I think at the end, I think I have come to think of it less about party affiliation. I don't think it's not necessarily the case that Republicans are better at Latino outreach than Democrats, or that Democrats take Latinos for granted, whereas Republicans have always felt like they've had to fight for their votes, so they're more engaged. I actually, in the end, think of it more in terms of the priorities of individual campaigns and candidates. And I think that there have been better Republican campaigns. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, I can say this because I've been thinking about it. The Trump campaign, the Latinos for Trump campaign, was better at Latino outreach this time than the Biden campaign was. It's just a fact. They had prioritized reaching out to Latinos since 2017 after Trump's inauguration. So the Latinos for Trump campaign this time was just better than the Biden campaign. And I don't think that says anything fundamentally about the Democratic Party, but I think it says something about Joe Biden as a candidate and his campaign. So, I'll talk about the Biden campaign just to set up the context, but, Joe Biden, Scranton, Pennsylvania, I mean, he didn't have like a natural connection with Latinos going into the primary campaigns. To the extent that he did, it was a kind of negative association based on his years as Obama's vice president with the deportations and building cages, things like that. So then Biden just staked his primary candidacy on other groups of voters, like the disaffected Republicans who might have voted for Trump in 2016, but were disappointed and wanted to switch to someone who reached out to the middle, like Joe Biden, or African Americans, like in South Carolina. And that turned out to be a very effective strategy for him in the primary campaign. But as a result, he didn't make a real effort to ramp up his Latino outreach campaign until late last spring, early this summer. And so I just bring him up as representative of this idea that it's just a campaign and a candidate that hadn't prioritized, hadn't said from the time that he decided to run for office that I am going to prioritize reaching out to Latinos. That just wasn't what he was doing. And I think that approach can happen among both Democrats and Republicans. So one thing you'll hear Chuck Rocha saying a lot these days is the key to Latino outreach is early and sustained engagement with a community, even when you're not looking for their votes. He's absolutely right, but he's not the first person to have that idea. Back in 1960, the Nixon campaign was when Nixon was running for president for the first time in 1960 against JFK. He hired a guy named Stuart Spencer, who had run some of his Senate campaigns in California. And his idea was that, look, to recruit Mexican Americans in East LA, you need to build health clinics in the community. You need to host job fairs for Mexican Americans in the community. You need to provide them legal advice to sort out their immigration issues when you're not looking for their votes. You need to have a sustained presence. And so that was a Republican doing it for Richard Nixon in 1960. And so, you know, I just think it's really about the candidate and the campaign that chooses to prioritize Latino outreach early on. And hopefully that's a lesson that both parties will take.
Right. I think, you know, obviously in this primary season, that kind of Latino outreach was something that Senator Sanders did very well, right?
Right.
Not in other communities, you know, obviously, but
right.
among Latinos, he certainly generated excitement. You raised Richard Nixon, and I want to talk about him because you spend a pretty significant part of the book dealing with Nixon, and I think that many of us are familiar with the story of the connection between Cuban exiles and the plumbers at Watergate, or the whole business of the census and counting Hispanics. But what you suggest is, I think, a much richer history of engagement with Latino communities. And you talk a lot about the so-called brown mafia. And I was wondering if you could sort of tell us a little bit about them and about how they influenced Nixon's outreach to Latino voters in the late 60s and early 70s.
Yeah. So, I mean, so the brown mafia was this, you know, it was a name that they called themselves kind of jokingly. They were, you know, White House officials, Nixon's aides, ironically led by a Japanese American named Bill Marumoto, who grew up in California and said he himself wasn't Chicano or Latino or Spanish speaking or Hispanic or anything, but he, you know, had stories about kind of growing up in Latino communities and near them and had a relationship with Latinos. But, you know, it was a group of individuals kind of brought into the White House during Nixon's first administration, charged with thinking through how to engage Latinos, provide services for them, how to cultivate their loyalty, even to the point of criminality. You know, I mean, they figured kind of heavily. There's the Cuban burglars association with Watergate, but in the Watergate testimony and all of the Senate Watergate hearings, some prominent Hispanics testified. Bill Marumoto also testified about these kind of pay-to-play schemes where Latino-owned businesses across the country would, you know, get federal grants in exchange for the promise of support to Richard Nixon. And there are all kinds of interesting examples of, like, you might have heard of Jose Angel Gutierrez, one of the founders of LREP, La Raza Unida Party. He apparently was involved in some crooked dealings in South Texas about having to do with the opening of a health clinic and the appointment of his wife as the head of the health clinic. And so all these things. So this is the brown mafia, the kind of his Latino insiders who were there to cultivate loyalty. But, you know, the big picture with Nixon is that, you know, there's a lot going on in the late 60s. His first term is not going well. There's Vietnam, there's prison riots in Attica, et cetera. And at the same time, African Americans are leaving the Republican Party in droves because the Republican Party opposes the Civil Rights Act and embraces the Southern strategy. And so Republican strategists are really self-conscious about very explicit about needing to replace lost African-American votes with new voters, and Latinos are their primary targets. And Nixon is in some ways, it doesn't seem like it, but he is in some ways a kind of natural candidate to do so because he's from California. After World War II, there's a series of kind of Western Republican candidates like Nixon and Goldwater and Reagan, and they claim like long-standing ties to the Mexican American community there. And at the same time, many Mexican Americans have the same thing. I mean, there's this whole kind of mythology about Nixon that he grew up next to Mexican Americans in the fields near Southeast Los Angeles, and so he becomes the candidate who reaches out to them. I'm going on and on, so I'll be very short. He is the first Republican candidate to win about a third of the Latino vote as a result of all of his engagement and outreach efforts and high-level political appointments. He appoints the first Hispanic treasurer of the United States, whose name is on American currency in the early 70s. So as a result, he wins a third of the Latino vote, kind of setting the bar for all Republican candidates afterwards. And ever since, Republican candidates have won about a third of the Latino vote, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more, but Nixon was the first to kind of break through.
He manages to tie together the political interest of Mexican American voters in the Southwest, right?
Yeah.
Who I think are concerned with issues of entrepreneurialism and access to Washington. And then on the other hand, Cuban voters in South Florida, who are deeply influenced by the Cold War, right? By Cold War politics. And I think that's one of it's clear that also becomes a theme for Republican candidates, from Eisenhower on, the importance of framing Latino participation in electoral politics in the United States as kind of a broader sort of Cold War strategy. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, so it happened through groups like the Cabinet Committee on Opportunities for Spanish-Speaking People. So Lyndon Johnson had actually created a predecessor called the Interagency Committee on Mexican American Affairs. And that makes sense for a couple of reasons. I mean, Johnson's from Texas. The Hispanics he worked with the most were Mexican Americans. Mexican Americans also were, as they remain, the largest Latino population. So, it made some degree of sense that the first kind of interagency committee in a presidential administration would have the name Interagency Committee on Mexican American Affairs. But Nixon, within weeks of becoming president, after his inauguration, he changed the name to the Cabinet Committee on Opportunities for Spanish-Speaking People. And he did that explicitly to kind of join different groups. And actually, I think there were like 9 members, and the membership was supposed to be divided up proportionally, like according to the percentage of the Latino population that was Cuban or Mexican American or Puerto Rican. And so it was intended to achieve a balance between these groups. This didn't happen easily. I mean, it was a kind of uncomfortable fit because Mexican Americans always argued that it should be all Mexican Americans, it should be all Southwesterners. And so there were rivalries between the different groups. And there remained rivalries. I mean, in some ways, there are still rivalries today. But one of the guys I interviewed, Al Zapanta, a Mexican American from California, told me that Cubans didn't really matter until 1980. And the reason that came up is because he kind of bristled at the idea that, Latino conservatism today, it's all about the Cuban Americans, it's all about the Cubans in South Florida. And he said, it didn't happen comfortably. There were still tensions and rivalries. I think Nixon kind of got that ball rolling, but it was actually like Reagan who really tried to crystallize a lot of it. And he made this shift away from patronage politics in the Nixon years and kind of reaching out to Latinos by giving them appointments and creating federal government jobs and moving towards an appeal based much more on ideological conservatism. And this is when he brought together his Hispanic advisors to try to articulate what the core characteristics were of the Latino conservative. And he pointed to like family values, patriotism, work ethic, anti-communism. And in some ways, that kind of set the course for the Republican Party for the next 4 decades into the present, because, the Republican Party always says about itself that, they don't buy into identity politics. We're all Americans first. And so I think trying to articulate the core characteristics of like family values, work ethic, that was all part of trying to move away from the identity politics and toward just an ideological conservatism.
And it seemed to work for Reagan, right? I mean, it really, that election in 1980, I mean, I think obviously, as you point out in the book, in 1976, he had actually done fairly well among Latino voters, particularly Cuban voters in Florida. But 1980 seemed like it was like a perfect storm for him, right? That he was able to draw support not just from Cubans in Florida, but Mexicans in the West, if not necessarily in California, right, where his record was just incredibly suspect, to put it mildly, right? But also among Puerto Rican voters, where he seemed to do well. He got about nearly 20% of the vote. I mean, what was it about Reagan? Was it this ideological framing that really helped him, or had the Republican Party matured enough and had enough operatives to sort of help him do this?
Yeah, you're right. There's a lot there. I mean, just like there was a lot going on during Nixon's first administration. I mean, there's a lot going on between 76 and 80 that really pushes forward support for Reagan. And so, first of all, there's a growing attention to Latinos by both parties because, there's this famous kind of 1978 Time magazine cover story about how the 1980s are going to be the decade of the Hispanic because of our population growth, greater inclusion in politics, all of these things. And so there was some sense that Latinos had momentum, and this is the moment when this whole idea of like the sleeping giant was born. And so there's that. And so both candidates are paying more attention. Reagan also had some of the advantages that Nixon did, claiming to be like a Western candidate, someone who had appointed more Mexican Americans to his administration since, the 19th century, since any governor in the 19th century. So there are those kinds of things. But he also was the first to kind of run a truly national advertising campaign on television, radio, print, and he hired the San Antonio advertising executive named Leonel Sosa, to whom he said, like, Leonel, you're going to have the easiest job ever because Hispanics are Republicans who just don't know it yet. And Leonel Sosa was the guy who kind of wrote a lot of his ad campaigns, came up with ideas for commercials and stuff like that. Leonel Sosa had run successful Republican campaigns in Texas for John Tower. So I think there's also that media role. And then there also is, the perceived failures of the Carter administration with the wars in Central America and the Sandinistas, and Reagan kind of taking a really hardline approach to communism. So kind of all of that came together during the 1980 election. And Reagan even built on those kinds of ideas in his first 4 years in office, and did even better in 1984 than he did in 1980.
Right. Let me, you raised the issue of Central America, and before we got on the call, I was telling you about my class on U.S. foreign policy, and I'm sort of feeling frustrated that I didn't talk enough about Central America. But you, in this book, talk about immigration generally, right? Which seems to be historically an issue that Hispanic Republicans and Hispanic Democrats can coalesce around, right? With some exceptions, right? Obviously, you have some people who, from a business perspective, they want more and free labor. Organized labor may not feel that way, but generally speaking, when it came to election time, you had a point of coalescing.
Yeah.
Then in the 1980s, with the Central American wars, the question of immigration now takes, it takes a different turn, right? Because it becomes about U.S. support or opposition to particular governments in Central America. How did that play out among Hispanic Republicans?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point. I mean, and so, during the Reagan years, well, really even starting in the late Carter administration. I mean, this is the beginning of the sanctuary movement and refugees. And in 1980, you have the signing of the Refugee Act, and, you know, this distinction between economic migrants and refugees. And the Reagan administration, in part because it would put them in an awkward position to consider Central Americans refugees from a civil war that they had played an important part in through their interventions. So, you know, the Reagan administration was always inclined to consider Central Americans to be economic migrants instead of refugees. But, you know, it did kind of place some pressure on Hispanic Republicans to kind of take a stand on Reagan's Central America policies. And by and large, they had no problem with the shipment of arms to Contras. I mean, even, you know, the Mexican-American congressman from New Mexico, Manuel Lujan, he openly supported the Contra War, but also many Nicaraguans who began to arrive in Miami in the 1980s. They were supported by the Cuban exiles who thought that it was like, you know, a moral issue to support the new Nicaraguan refugees. They could kind of identify with them because they were in the same situation the Cuban exiles had been some 25 years earlier. So a lot of Bay of Pigs veterans trained Contra soldiers in Miami, and a lot of the arms shipments, you know, funneled through Miami, and there were health clinics in Miami to take care of or, you know, help Contra soldiers recuperate. So there's really a lot there. And in some ways, this is like the story of politicians like Ileana Ros-Lehtinen in Cuba, or in Miami. She's the first Cuban-American congresswoman. I mean, a lot of her career is spent supporting Nicaraguan refugees. And so, you know, I think that relates to your first point about how on the issue of immigration, Hispanic Republicans are often more like their Democratic counterparts. And this also came out in the Immigration Reform and Control Act debates, where all Hispanics, Democrats and Republicans, were in favor of the amnesty provisions, but opposed to the employer sanctions provisions of IRCA. So, you know, I think Hispanic Republicans generally were kind of moderating voices within the Republican Party when it came.
Right. And they also managed to push Reagan to adopt policy. It wasn't just that they sort of, you know, were, you know, voices in the wilderness, right? I mean, they do manage to get Reagan to take a much, I guess, a much more humane view of undocumented immigrants, almost something that would be completely unacceptable today, right? Reagan does take a view that is much more open to the arrival or the processing, right, of undocumented immigrants.
Yeah, whether it was through some sense of humanity or desire for compromise or something. I mean, maybe that stuff can be debated, but it is a fact that IRCA, he signed a bill that included, you know, amnesty for 2 million Mexican immigrants, 2 million Mexican immigrants, right, and a greater number if you include everyone. And so, and he made statements, you know, in his first campaign about Mexico's our most important ally. We don't need a 9-foot fence. At the time, it was only 9 feet. Now it's like 30 feet or whatever, but we don't need a 9-foot fence between our two countries. It's interesting. In the past couple of weeks, I've been talking a lot to Latino conservatives about how they feel about this election and what kind of sense of momentum they have because of Trump's expanded share of support. And they've actually been comparing Trump much more to Reagan than to someone like George W. Bush, because, you know, ironically, like, Trump was the first Republican to actually expand his support among Latinos since George W. Bush. So in some ways, he's the second coming of George W. Bush, but they actually claim that he's much more like Reagan in terms of his ideological appeal based on like ideological conservatism, but with that one major exception of like immigration and border policy. Reagan had a much different approach than.
Which is fascinating, because as you point out, the man who was the architect of Reagan's advertising, Leonel Sosa, is unequivocal, right, in his rejection of Trump.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Oh,
I mean, it's almost it's funny to hear that that view of Trump and Reagan, when somebody who was so close to Reagan, sort of says, I'm not on board here, I'm out here, right?
Yeah, I'm out. Yeah, and in a lot of the interviews I did in the months leading up to even the 2016 election, but especially, even after the 2016 election, basically over the past few years, the Hispanic Republicans who were most wrestling with their continued support for the Republican Party were an older generation. I mean, it was the people who came into the party during the Reagan years and the Bush years, because they see the Republican Party of the Reagan and Bush years as a much more inclusive, big tent Republican Party than the party of Trump. So it's more often people like Leonel Sosa who are going to reject the Republican Party of Trump now, because they say the Republican Party has abandoned the values that they thought it stood for when they joined. And so in an interesting way, it's actually the new Republicans, the youth who didn't come into the party during the Reagan or Bush years, who don't have the problem with Trumpism, because Trump's the only Republican president they know. And so that presents interesting generational divides, because you think that youth skew much more progressive, and they're the Latino voters that Bernie Sanders engaged, but Trump had his fair share of Latino youth supporters as well.
Yeah, you can see that obviously in South Florida, with more recent arrivals from Cuba, who seem much more moved by Trump's rhetoric, by his style, by his I guess his brashness. Than you would possibly imagine. I wanted to ask you, and then I want to try to move to some of the questions from the group. But two women feature sort of prominently in your story, right? Ramona Bañuelos, Catherine Ortega. And I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about how it is that Latinas figured into this history of Hispanics in the GOP, because they seem to, in Bañuelos' case in particular, she's all over the country for Nixon. She's a major ambassador for him in the campaign. What was it that they saw? What was the hook with these women? And also, what did these women see in their candidates, in Nixon for Bañuelos, Reagan for Ortega? What did they see in these men?
Yeah, there's and by the way, one of these women is in New York. I don't know. She's a member of the board of trustees of one of the universities. Her name is Rita DiMartino.
Oh yeah, she's an institution in New York City. Yeah,
she's
for
amazing,
sure.
Man. I mean, she's amazing.
To be at AT&T for a long time. Yeah.
I don't know I can't remember what university it is in New York that she's on the board of trustees at. I can't remember, but yeah, I interviewed her. She's fascinating. I mean, she's really interesting. She was the local chairwoman of the Republican National Hispanic Assembly for the Northeast region for a while. So yeah, I mean, there is a history of women being involved in the Hispanic Republican movement. I think, one of the most fascinating things I came across was this fact that, just a curious fact, that Republican presidents from Nixon forward have a kind of tradition of appointing Hispanic women to the post of Treasurer of the United States. And I think there's a lot there that's symbolic. First of all, it's not, it's a largely symbolic position. I mean, you get to sign the currency, you get to, have your name on dollar bills, and you kind of oversee the mint, but you're not making financial policy. It's not a decision.
You're not the Treasury Secretary.
Yeah,
right?
You're not the Treasury Secretary. So that's a different thing. You're not Mnuchin, you're signing the currency. Right. So it's largely symbolic. But I think the symbolism is also important, because they're all Latina business women, So Romana Bañuelos, for example, she founded a tortilla company, a factory in East LA that is still operating today. It's called Ramona's Mexican Food Products. It's one of the largest Mexican food distributors in the Southwest. And it's interesting. She decided to call the company Ramona's instead of Romanas, because she thought that English speakers would have a hard time with the word Romana. So she went with Ramona. But these are like Latina business women. So in that sense, they represent the idea that, women don't have to be stuck at home taking care of kids. They can have professional careers and professional opportunities. But she also, in the late 60s, early 70s, is decidedly not a radical. She's not a Chicana. She is not, as she puts it in interviews, she's not like a women's lib kind of feminist. So, she still has kind of traditional values, free enterprise, economic uplift, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. She has this whole story that she entered the United States with 36 cents. Then she made $36 on her first day with the tortilla factory. She made $36,000 as the treasurer of the United States. So, it's the story of uplift, and that's what she's representative of. And then as surrogates, they could kind of go around to different Latino communities and talk about how, look, I have a seat at the table of this Republican administration, so you can tell that Nixon is someone who cares about us. And Reagan did the same thing. He appointed Catherine Ortega, and Catherine Ortega was even the first keynote speaker at a Republican National Convention in 1984. So it's the same kind of symbolism. And it is, whenever they would go to speak in Latino communities, they were shouted down as tokens and, not representative of the kinds of changes that Latinos needed. But they still played an important role, I think, for these Republican administrations. And I think the gender aspect is that they're women who can have professional success, but they don't rock the boat too much. They're not radicals. So I think they kind of fit the Republican Party's messaging.
Right. Let me, I lied. One final question.
Okay. I'll try to be.
Yeah. You write in your book about the Trump presidency, right? And how, despite this rhetoric that we're all familiar with, that is, it's vulgar, it's a million things.
Yeah.
That there seemed to be this core group of Latino voters who even though they were put off by his language, they had gone through a transformation politically, right? Where they had gone from, and you write it this way, you say man, not party, now party, not man, right? Yeah. They had really, I'm voting for a Republican because I'm a Republican.
Yeah.
I found that fascinating because in some ways it's the same argument that you have among Democrats, and that Republicans had been arguing against for decades, right? It's like, why are you loyal to this party,
right,
that sort of shortchanges you? I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that and about those folks and what your conversations were with them.
Well, so here's the problem I was trying to explain. The problem is that, for decades, we've been wondering, is there going to be this moment when Latinos abandon the Republican Party en masse, like Leonel Sosa, but on a much larger scale, when they just say, we can't do this anymore. We thought that a moment like Proposition 187 in California might do it. That's widely considered to be the, death knell of the Republican Party in California. And we thought that as anti-immigrant policies kind of spread across the United States, that would be it. So part of the loyalty argument, part of what I was trying to answer is this kind of enduring support for the Republican Party, even as the party moved to the right on immigration and border issues. And, I think that since the 90s, as the party moved to the right, the Republican Party, Latinos have been harder pressed to justify their support for Republicans, but they haven't abandoned the party. So they've said things like Latinos aren't single issue voters. We care more about the economy, healthcare, education than we do about immigration. That's always been true, that Latinos have never been single issue voters, but it's only since the party has taken a sharp right turn that Latinos have felt the need to justify it, to say it louder and louder, that we care about many more things. So, you know, I think, again, I wouldn't want to hang too much of my argument on my grandpa's story or even the story of a handful of others, but I talked to my grandpa like 2 weeks before the election, and I just asked him, you know, he's 95 now, he lives in a VA home in Arizona, and I was asking him, you know, how do you feel about Donald Trump? And he said, oh, Donald Trump is a good guy because he's a Republican. That's it. There was nothing else. There was no policy behind it. It was just because he's a Republican. And the other conversation that sticks out with me is this interview with Danielle Garza, the head of the Libre initiative. And he's the guy who gave me this party man idea, party over man idea, because he was telling me, like, look, I might not love Trump. He might not represent all of my values, but I'm not going to let one man ruin the movement that I've helped to build over a course of decades. So I'm going to vote for him, but my vote for him is going to be a vote for the Republican Party, not for the man. So that to me just became something to explain, like, how do you develop this sense of partisan loyalty that overrides some issues that seem so morally repugnant and offensive, you know? And Danielle Garza too, he told me, like, you know, what Trump says about immigration, that's hard to defend. I can't defend that, you know, but the Republican Party still represents his values more. So, you know, I think I published the hardcover. I'm actually working on paperback revisions now, and it's going to have to somehow take into account the election. And, you know, I think in where I left this book in the hardcover is just like, we don't, you know, maybe there will come this moment when what we've all expected, Latinos abandoning the Republican Party en masse, maybe that will happen. I don't know, but it could go in the other direction as well. And so now, you know, it was kind of speculative in the hardcover, but now we know that Republicans can expand support even with this kind of anti-immigrant message. And so I think we're still trying to figure out what that means.
And even after having done, you know, an autopsy, you know, that told them to do the exact opposite, right? It's a fascinating bit of, you know, ignoring your consultant's advice, right?
Well, totally. But you know what the thing that Latino Republicans have been telling me over the past couple of weeks, they've been calling, okay, so, you know, the theory of Latino outreach, that the theory of the case was built on George W. Bush's success,
right,
winning 40 and 44%. And the idea was that the way he did that was by supporting comprehensive immigration reform. And all the, you know, the settled narrative is that in the months leading up to 9/11, he and Vicente Fox were working closely to craft this compromise on immigration. And so the theory behind George W. Bush's support was that a Republican could maximize support among Latinos by supporting comprehensive immigration reform. And this is what I've been asking Latino conservatives about over the past couple of weeks, including Danielle Garza. Like, is that still the theory of the case, or is it not the theory of the case? And they've all said that no, it's not the theory of the case, because what Trump has shown is that you appeal to Latinos with true ideological conservatism, not by, as they've called it, they've called Bush's approach Republican light. And it's more kind of taking the left's warnings that you had to support comprehensive immigration reform than truly standing for conservative principles. And
it's almost like returning to Goldwater, right? You know, it's a fascinating,
So it's interesting, man. I don't, you know, they might be wrong, by the way. Like, Republicans could very well be wrong. Their party has a lot of work to do. I mean, they have won one popular vote in the 21st century. So before they start talking about themselves too much as like the working class party and multicultural party, they have a lot of work to do. And it's hard to imagine their argument that they're actually truly the more inclusive party than the Democratic Party. So I mean, I'm not taking for granted that Republicans are right about this theory of the case, but this is the optimism they feel in this moment.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions in the chat. And one of them comes from my friend Victoria Stone, and it's about the media. and how you see the role of the media in shaping political messages, and the effectiveness of these campaigns aimed at Latinos. What do you see there?
I think there's a lot to say about that, you know, and media now I take to mean social media in addition to the traditional news outlets. And, you know, one of the things that, okay, so another thing that Latino conservatives have been saying over the past couple of weeks, one woman told me that this victory was historic and we moved the needle. And I asked her about that. I was like, what do you mean historic? Like George W. Bush actually won a greater share of the Latino vote than Trump did. But she said, but what Trump did was 100 times more impressive than what Bush did. And what she meant by that is that Trump's support was developed organically. And so it happened not because of anything the campaign did, but through kitchen table conversations, conversations in churches, through the Trump trains and boat brigades and things like that. There was just an emerging conversation. So I bring that up because it's a little disingenuous, because Trump, first of all, the Latinos for Trump campaign did a lot, but Trump was also on TV every day and super active on Facebook and other platforms, and ads circulated like wildfire on social media. So in that sense, you didn't have to have a fully developed campaign infrastructure because the message was circulating on Facebook as well. So, you know, I think media, and in some ways, like I think the Trump campaign was, you know, they've never had with Latinos the kind of get out the vote, knock on doors operation. I mean, they do knock on doors, but that's not the kind of model in the same way that that Democrats do it. And I think there are lots of reasons for that. I mean, the Republican appeal has always been through these kind of broad-based issues like religious freedom or economic development or something. And that's a kind of blunt instrument that you can circulate across the nation through social media, and it circulates easily. So I think that's one answer to the media thing. Another thing I've been thinking a lot about is the kind of democratic media machine that has helped craft this narrative that Latinos are natural Democrats who we vote as a bloc, and what we care about is immigration, the environment, things like that. Democrats are like groups like Latino Decisions or Unidos US or Naleo. They're invested in this idea that Latinos are a voting bloc. And that's important for all kinds of reasons, because then it helps Latinos go make the argument on Capitol Hill that there's like strength in numbers and we care about Head Start, immigration reform, things like that. And some of the Democratic strategists I've been talking to over the past couple of weeks, what they're worried about is that the lesson the Democratic Party will take from this election is that, well, look, if Latinos don't prioritize immigration reform, why should we?
Right.
And well, if Latinos aren't a reliable voting bloc, why should we invest so much in them? So Democrats are worried about that. And I bring this up in connection with the media conversation because it's just a fact that, you know, a lot of the experts who get trotted out to analyze and explain the Latino vote on TV, like MSNBC or whatever, they're basically Democrats. And that's fine. I'm a Democrat. I'm partisan too. But I think that if you are trying to explain and analyze the Latino vote, but only doing that from the Democratic perspective, you're not helping Americans explain what's going on. And that's what leads to our surprise when Trump's share of support expands. That's what leads us to ask, like, how did this happen? We were told this wasn't going to happen, you know?
Right. It's the flip side of the, I guess the Democratic problem with adopting an equally Manichaean worldview, right? That they, if you see things only in these stark terms of good and evil, right? You never get to see, where most people live, which is somewhere, somewhere in the middle. Let me ask you, one of my students, Morgan Winston, asked, and obviously my students ask very direct questions, right? So,
yeah,
they just come to it like,
that's good training.
What's the straw that you think would break the camel's back to make Latino voters leave the Republican Party?
Oh man, I don't know. I mean, because, I've been thinking a lot about this as a historian. I think as a historian, two things. One, I can say with, a degree of confidence that no matter the twists and turns the Republican Party has taken over the past few decades, the support for Republicans by Latinos has remained remarkably consistent. And that could lead you to believe that, even as the Republican Party embraces, the construction of a border wall or anti-immigrant positions, or supports a candidate who says all kinds of things and does all kinds of things, who fundamentally, puts Stephen Miller in charge of our immigration policy or whatever. So you would expect that it would have happened, and it hasn't. So on the one hand, that leads you to believe that their faith is pretty unshakable. And as Donald Trump said it, he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and not lose any support, So I don't know. But the other thing, as a historian, we believe in like contingency, and that's this idea that just because things have been a certain way for 50 years doesn't mean that they're destined to remain that way for the next 50 years. So things still could change, but I don't know that we know the direction of the change yet. I do believe that this is a moment of political realignment in ways that we don't understand. You have the Republican Party, you have Marco Rubio tweeting that the future of the Republican Party is as a working class, multiracial party. That's hard for me to imagine right now, but, I can't promise that it's not going to happen. So I do think that, over the next few years, hopefully, I remember this was interesting. I remember talking to Carlos Odio last week. He's the co-founder of Equis Research with Stephanie Valencia. He worked in the Obama administration. He told me what he hopes for over the next 4 years is that Latinos get the white working class treatment. And he said that we don't need a hillbilly elegy for Latinos, but we can put that aside, but he hopes that the Democratic Party will pay the same attention to Latinos over the next 4 years that the Democratic Party paid to like the white working class voters. Again, this is the whole theory of the case with Joe Biden, right? Joe Biden was going to bring home white working class voters. That's why he won the nomination, right? And so the idea with Latinos getting the white working class treatment is that Democrats will, starting today, starting tomorrow, invest in understanding and engaging Latinos to try to bring Latinos home. So, the other thing I would say as a Democrat, and things that Democrats get frustrated with right now, they're frustrated, we're frustrated that the media would almost make it seem like Trump won the election with Latinos. He won the Latino vote because there's so much focus on Trump's increase of support, when in fact, if it's true that he won 32%, that falls within the historical range. So why are we making such a big deal out of it? But, I don't know. I tend to think that the reason we're paying so much attention is because it's the more surprising thing. It's, it's the thing that requires more explanation right now, how Trump could have expanded his support given everything he's said and done. Right. So this does not answer your question, Morgan. I don't know. I really don't know.
She's in my class. She's accustomed to not having her questions answered. So,
but look, what's it going to be? What's it going to be? I don't know. This is a question about Trump in general, this guy who has assaulted or been accused of assaulting 26 women, who has done everything imaginable, still won 70 million votes or more. So I don't know what's going to break the camel's back.
Right. And you're right. There are these moments of historical realignment. Even the African American community, walking away from the Republican Party at the beginning of the the century, right? I mean, we do have these moments in American political history, but yeah, the uncertainty is absolutely there. Let me move to another question from a colleague here, Stephen Tran, who writes in his own research on Second Amendment politics and in his own personal experience, there are very similar dynamics that have played out in conservative Asian American communities, especially the Vietnamese American community. But it wasn't accompanied by the same political courting and strategies of patronage that you've documented with Latino conservatives, though certainly there are comparable histories of Cold War militancy. Does this comparison sound right to you? What do you make of this? Yeah,
it sounds absolutely right to me. And, you know, I was talking to a Times reporter a few days ago named Ford Fessenden. He's like he's a reporter who does like data visualizations. And what he's finding is that even in, you know, securely democratic states like California, there was a kind of baseline shift by not just Latinos in Orange County or Santa Ana, but also among Vietnamese communities in California, where I think the reason why California is important is that the Trump campaign was doing nothing in California. I mean, why is the Trump campaign going to invest anything in California? But there was still a baseline shift in immigrant communities, recently arrived, recently naturalized communities, not only among Latinos, but also among Asian Americans. And I think a lot of it, I mean, I don't know if it's just about the Second Amendment, if that's what you were saying. I don't know if that's what, and I'm looking down here because your name is down here, but you're not right there. But, you know, I don't know if it's about the Second Amendment. I think that it was an issue among some Latino conservatives, but I do think that there was like a baseline shift. And, you know, what do I make of the fact, though, that it happened in Asian American communities in the absence of outreach and political courting? I mean, that's a great question. I mean, it has a lot to do just in general with an even greater inattention to Asian American communities. I mean, for example, Florida has a massive Asian American community, but when, you know, we talk about Florida politically, it's about, you know, to the extent that we recognize diversity at all, it's that there are not just Cubans in South Florida, but also Colombians, Venezuelans, Mexicans, and then there are a lot of Puerto Ricans in Central Florida. There's a retiree community in North Florida, but we didn't hear anything this election cycle about Asian American voters in Florida, you know? So I think there's an even greater inattention to Asian Americans. I would love to hear your thoughts about why. I mean, I don't know. I don't know why. I mean, racism always pops to mind. Numerical significance pops to mind. Voting propensity pops to mind, but I don't know.
Right. I think that it's interesting, right? The connections between the experience, for example, of, you know, Vietnamese exiles here in the United States and Cuban exiles. You know, I don't know how many people here have read The Sympathizer, you know, which sort of chronicles the experience of Vietnamese exiles. But as I finished reading it, I was thinking to myself, this is, you know, arguably one of the finest novels of the Cuban Revolution ever written, except that it, you know, it's based on Vietnam, right? I mean, you could literally, as I was reading it, I was thinking to myself, I've heard this story before, obviously not as eloquently put, but I do think I think your larger point there about the lack of outreach to Asian Americans, people from the subcontinent, Indians, have also been largely ignored. You know, we're starting to see, I think, a bit more of a change in places like New Jersey, for example, where Indian voters are becoming much more active and much more important. So yeah, I think that's interesting. I wonder if there are any other questions from the audience.
Stephen, there's a woman at Occidental College, a historian named Jane Hong, who's writing about Asian American politics and Asian American evangelical conservatives. So she could be someone to be in touch with, Jane Hong.
And I think we have another question here. Oh boy, this is a tough one from Martin Spinato. Do you have any data indicating if Hispanic Latino Trump supporters also buy into the Q conspiracy narratives? I'm actually worried about asking that question after being Zoom bombed, because I don't know what's going to happen now after mentioning Q here. But
yeah,
anyway.
I'll lower the temperature a little
Please,
bit by saying, you know, I'm not entirely sure. The way I've been thinking about this disinformation stuff is that, you know, no, Martin, don't apologize.
Okay.
I mean, the disinformation stuff got a lot of attention, but you know, what I've been thinking is that, like, this is not the first time that Republicans have used disinformation as a strategy. I mean, Obama was called a socialist. Republicans have been calling Democrats socialists for decades, you know? So in some ways, so that's disinformation. I mean, that's literally disinformation in the sense that you're like tarring a Democratic candidate with a label that, you know, doesn't represent that person's views. But I think there must be something about social media that makes it spread easier, and memes, and you know, just the way that we consume information now compared with 2008, even, when, you know, it's amazing how rapidly technological environments change. And, you know, there was no TikTok and Instagram. I don't know if the disinformation traveled over Instagram in particular. I heard a lot about TikTok. So maybe disinformation spreads in different ways on social media, and maybe you can manipulate images in different ways than you could in 2008. But I think the fact of disinformation, I mean, that's like a old political strategy. I mean, the Nixon's people, the rat fuckers, you know, as they were called, the people who were trying to plant all kinds of bad information in people's hands. So it's like an old political strategy. So I do take the conservative Latino line on this, is that it's offensive to Latinos to think that Latinos would be any more susceptible to disinformation than any other group of Americans, you know, and to think that Latinos are somehow like uniquely fooled or too stupid to know what's disinformation or not. That does sound offensive a little bit. So I think, you know, anyway, so I don't know. That's my general thought about it. Disinformation, I think it did play a role in the campaign. I don't have data to quantify how much people were persuaded by disinformation now, but those are my general thoughts about it.
Let me, thanks. Let me ask a question from my colleague, Belinda Rincon. She writes that you touched a little on the subject of conservative gender discourses, but she's curious to hear your thoughts on how gender narratives were at work during the recent election. For example, we know that when Trump spoke to the quote unquote suburban women, that he was really speaking to white women. How do you think Trump appealed at all to Latinas and to Latinos?
Well, I mean, we do know that among other divides, rural, urban, class divides, the gender divide was especially pronounced this year and in 2016. I mean, I guess I haven't seen, maybe you guys know numbers about 2020 better than I do, but in 2016, 2/3 of Trump's Latino support came from Latino males, right, and 1/3 of his support came from Latinas. The exact opposite was true for Clinton. 2/3 of her Latino support came from women and 1/3 came from males. And that gender gap didn't really exist in the 80s. It was much like the men and women, you know, the split was much closer to 50-50. I don't know exactly what it was, but it wasn't as pronounced as it is now. And so, you know, I'm sure you guys have read a lot of the same things I have about machismo and authoritarianism and strong leaders. And that's the explanation for why Trump does so well among Latino males. And, you know, frankly, a lot of the Latina Republicans I've talked to, women like Bertica Cabrera Morris, who's an organizer in Florida, you know, she also talks about how Latinas like strong leaders, you know, so take that for what it's worth. But I also, you know, I would also point to things like, you know, 50% of the Border Patrol is Latino, Latinos serve in the military. at high rates. They work in police departments. These are also, masculine work cultures that skew conservative. So I would also look to those kinds of gender dynamics to explain what the support was about. I like your point about suburban women speaking to white women. It's true. That's a kind of the way that, Republicans think about identity politics is interesting. I mean, when they talk about, the Wisconsin dairy farmer, that they're talking about white farmers. They're not thinking about the fact that there are thousands of lecheros in Wisconsin. They're talking about the white dairy farmers. When they talk about suburban housewives, forget the fact that there are many Latinas and Latinos who live in suburbs. It's a kind of coded appeal. So I think that's kind of how, Republicans like to say that they don't play identity politics. They certainly do. It's just a different kind of identity politics. It's more a more coded appeal.
I think that may be the last question. I'll put out a final call to to the room to see if anybody has anything that they want to ask Jerry.
I see one question from Martin that I'll respond to quickly, because I think this is a great question too. I mean, the socialism thing, this is something we're going to be figuring out for the next few years. And I've heard like two different ideas. One way to answer the socialism message is to kind of double down and explain what we mean by the proper role of the government in healthcare and education and the economy and financial regulation, and try to distinguish it from socialism, or embrace the term socialism and say what it really means is just an active government role in American life, those kinds of things. So the way to combat the socialism stuff is to kind of engage and double down and explain. But then I've heard other people say that to even do that engages the Republican message on its own terms, and it gets into the argument about what socialism is. And I guess the idea, so the counter argument would be that anytime we're arguing about what socialism is, we're losing, because we're trying to split hairs between what different kinds of government and activism and government involvement are or is. And if we have to have that argument, we're having it on Republican terms. So I guess the counter argument would be that you just say, like, you guys are ridiculous. This is not what's going on. But I don't know. I mean, that's a quandary.
Yeah, the old political consultant in me remembers the phrase, "If you're explaining, you're losing."
Right.
And people don't spend as much time thinking about these things as political operatives and politicians think. They make fairly quick decisions, and also I think, and I can just speak about the experience of the Cuban community. I think it's not a good faith argument, right? People are not interested in a good faith argument about the nature of socialism. They are using it as a political cudgel. So trying to have the conversation, I think, probably is a waste of time, when you could, in fact, to Carlos Odio's point, spend a lot more time talking about pocketbook issues. Instead of having more Times stories about diners, I think we need more Times stories about bodegas. It's like, what's happening there, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's a better use of the party's time. But that's my
maybe the answer to the socialism question is also just working on this dilemma of the erosion of truth, or the fact that we can't agree on basic facts of things. And so, maybe if we can figure out how to establish reason in basic facts, that would help us have the conversation about socialism. Because I think your point about like a good faith argument, and this is a bad faith argument, I mean, maybe that would be less easy to accomplish or to have succeed if we could at least kind of reestablish new terms of debate. But I don't have a whole bunch of optimism in that happening right now, but
yeah,
work towards it.
Yep. Every day in the classroom. So let me, I want to wrap this up. First of all, let me just say a quick word of thanks to all the people who helped put this together. My colleagues at the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies at the Graduate Center, Victoria Stone, Andreina Torres, Lidia Hernandez, Kathy Cabrera, who's here, of course, and my colleagues at John Jay, the Department of Public Management, Professor Heath Brown, my chair, Jose Luis Morin of the Department of Latin American and Latinx Studies, and the Faculty Student Engagement Fund at John Jay, which was nice enough to provide some financial support for this project. For those of you who are interested, we have in the chat a link to Jerry's book. I highly recommend it. It's a good read. It's nice to actually read a historian who cares about the reader and cares about a good narrative and good story. And this is a great one. So Jerry, I really appreciate you making time to join us here at CUNY, man. Congratulations on this book. And I'm sure that, you know, there's going to be a lot to do between now and 2024, even though we don't want to think about it, but I'm sure you'll be doing it, man.
Yeah, and let me add my thanks to you guys, because I know that if you're anything like me and the people I talk to, my students at Northwestern, you know, like, we're simultaneously hungry for human connection, and that's why we do this, even if we're tired of sitting in front of our computers all day. So I just bring that up to say that I know that it's you know, investing an hour of your time at, you know, 8 p.m. when you could be doing other things is not insignificant. So I really thank, you know, John for putting this together, all of you for hosting me, and all of you for coming, because I know that time is very valuable these days. And I hope that I can meet you in person someday. So thank you.
Well, it was time well spent, my man. All right. Thanks so much. Thanks to everybody for coming. Enjoy your evening. And I'm sure we'll be having more of these events in the new year. So you know, make sure to get on the CLACLS mailing list.
Yeah. Take care.
Thanks, guys. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye. You too.
Bye-bye.